Okay, real talk before we get into this. The title alone should have you asking one question. Not how does this end? No. The question is, what kind of man gets called a commoner by an entire alien court, stands there and takes it, and somehow still ends up being the one person a princess refuses to live without? Because that's not a power fantasy. That's something messier, something more real. Hold that thought. The day I arrived on Veilthari Prime, I had exactly 3 things going for me. A second-class diplomatic transit visa, a duffel bag with a broken zipper, and the kind of stubbornness my mother always said would either save my life or end it. Her words, not mine. But she wasn't wrong. My name is Caden Voss. I was 31 years old, a xenolinguistics field consultant attached to the Colonial Outreach Division, which sounds impressive until you realize that my entire department was 2 people, a borrowed server rack, and a budget that got quietly cut every fiscal quarter. I wasn't military. I wasn't a diplomat. I wasn't anyone they'd put on a poster. What I was good at languages. Good enough that when the Veilthari court sent back 3 consecutive human negotiators because the translation matrix carries emotional inaccuracies that insult the royal register, I was the one they called. The briefing was 40 minutes long and covered exactly nothing useful. What I knew about the Veilthari from that briefing: tall, 4-fingered, bioluminescent tracery beneath their skin that shifted color with emotional state. Blue for calm, gold for pleasure, red for something the briefing document politely called heightened sovereign authority, and which I later learned just meant fury. They had been a spacefaring civilization for roughly 6,000 years before humanity figured out fire. Their court ran on a social hierarchy so layered and precise that getting someone's honorific wrong wasn't just rude, it was technically a declaration of aggression. What I did not know, that the court had already decided they hated me before my shuttle touched down. The landing platform was at the top of a tower grown entirely from compressed mineral lattice, the kind of architecture that doesn't look built so much as coaxed into existence over centuries. The afternoon light came in sideways through the open arches, and for a second, just one, I forgot I was nervous. The place was genuinely beautiful in a way that made your chest go quiet. Then the doors opened, and Lord Vane Solith was standing there. He was the court's protocol director, tall even by Veilthari standards, with deep amber tracery along his jaw and neck, and the particular kind of stillness that powerful people use to remind you they're not in a hurry, because they don't have to be. He looked me over once, just once. "A xenolinguist," he said. His command of human standard was flawless, which meant the disdain in his voice was entirely deliberate. "They sent us a translator." I nodded. "Caden Voss, field consultant, Colonial Outreach. No military rank?" "No." "No diplomatic title?" "No." "No noble lineage, presumably." I almost said something I would have regretted. Instead, I said, "I'm told I'm good at listening." He studied me another moment. The tracery along his jaw flickered, a color I couldn't read yet. "The last 3 humans they sent had titles," he said. "We returned them. Perhaps a commoner will at least be honest about his limitations." He turned and walked back through the doors without waiting to see if I followed. I followed. Of course I followed. But I want you to understand, that word landed. Commoner. The way he said it wasn't an observation. It was a category, a ceiling, a door that was already closed before I'd even knocked. The palace interior was nothing like I expected. I'd seen images, but images don't carry the acoustics, the way sound moved through mineral lattice differently than through stone or steel, giving every corridor a kind of resonance, like the building itself was holding its breath. The bioluminescent plants running along the upper archways cast light that shifted slowly, minute to minute, responding to something I couldn't identify. The staff we passed didn't look at me, not actively ignoring me, more like I wasn't registering as worth the attention. I counted 7 people in the first corridor, not one glance. Lord Solith stopped at a set of inner doors and turned. "You will be housed in the diplomatic quarters, East Wing. You will not enter the residential wing. You will not address members of the royal family unless spoken to first. You will not speak in formal court unless the protocol director," he touched his chest briefly, "clears the content of your speech in advance. And if I need to speak to someone without advance clearance, you won't. But if I did," he looked at me with something close to interest, not respect, just recalibration. like he was adjusting an assumption slightly downward. "You won't," he repeated, and then he left. My room was adequate, functional. The window looked out over a lower garden where something with 6 legs was eating flowers slowly and with enormous concentration. And I sat on the edge of the bed and opened my translation notes and tried to remember why I'd said yes to this assignment. Right, because no one else would take it. The Veilthari court had rejected every human delegate in the last 2 years. Trade negotiations between the Colonial Alliance and the Veilthari sovereignty had been stalled so long that the original agreement framework was technically expired. There were people on both sides who were very comfortable with that stalemate. And there were people, fewer of them, quieter, who thought that if someone didn't get this right soon, comfortable stalemate was going to quietly become something worse. I wasn't there to be impressive. I was there because sometimes the job just needs doing, and the person available is the person who shows up. I didn't know, sitting in that room on my first night, that the reason 3 human delegates had been turned away wasn't actually the translation matrix. I didn't know that someone in the palace had been deliberately engineering those failures. And I had absolutely no idea that somewhere in the residential wing, the wing I had been specifically, pointedly forbidden to enter, a princess was sitting in the dark, reading every report filed about the failed negotiations, and had been waiting for someone to arrive who wasn't playing the game the way everyone else was playing it. I ate alone that first night. The food was good. The silence was loud. Outside, the mineral tower hummed its long, slow note into the dark. And I had the strange feeling, the kind you don't trust because it doesn't make logical sense, that something had already started. I just didn't know what yet. Something about that moment gets me every time. The guy walks into a court that has already written him off, gets handed a ceiling the moment he steps through the door, and instead of flinching, he just keeps moving. But here's what I keep thinking about. The princess, sitting alone, reading every failed report. She wasn't waiting for a hero. She was waiting for someone who hadn't been broken by the system yet. The first time I saw her, I was technically trespassing. Not intentionally. I want to be clear about that. I had followed the sound. It was the 3rd morning. I'd spent 2 days in what the protocol director called orientation sessions, which were really just long silences punctuated by Veilthari court officials explaining, in patient and increasingly patronizing detail, all the ways a human could cause offense without meaning to. Don't touch the lattice columns. They hold acoustic memory and physical contact is intimate by Veilthari standards. Don't make sustained eye contact with anyone above the 3rd court tier unless they initiate it first. Don't walk faster than the person beside you if that person outranks you, which, Lord Solith reminded me, was almost everyone. I sat through all of it, took notes, asked a few questions that earned me long pauses and careful looks. On the 3rd morning, before the session started, I went walking. The East Wing corridors were quiet at that hour, that particular quality of quiet that only exists before a building fully wakes up. I was working through pronunciation drills in my head, the formal register of Veilthari court speech, which has 7 distinct tonal layers and treats stress placement like a moral question. I wasn't paying attention to where I was going. I was listening to the acoustics, the way the lattice carried sound differently around corners, and then I heard it. Music. Not music exactly. The Veilthari word for it, I'd learn later, translates closest to something like ordered light expressed as sound, which sounds pretentious in English but makes complete sense once you hear it. It was coming from somewhere ahead and to the left, past a junction I was fairly certain wasn't on my approved map. I went left anyway. The corridor opened into a small interior garden, not the large formal ones I'd seen from windows, but something quieter, more private, carved into the heart of the building with a single open ceiling panel, letting in a column of pale morning light. Growing things I didn't have names for lined the walls. And in the center, sitting on the edge of a low mineral bench with a stringed instrument across her knees, was a woman whose bioluminescent tracery was the softest, steadiest gold I'd seen since landing. She stopped playing the moment she heard me. I stopped walking. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then she said, in perfect human standard, with an accent that carried the musical quality of Veilthari formal speech, "You took the wrong corridor." "I did," I said. "The diplomatic quarters are east. This is the residential approach." "I know. I heard the music." Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth exactly, more like the door opened a crack. "That's not a sufficient reason to enter a restricted corridor," she said. "No," I agreed. "It's not." Another silence. Her tracery stayed gold. I'd already learned enough to know that was a good sign. "You're the xenolinguist," she said. "Caden Voss. I know your name." She said it simply, no weight on it, not a power move, just fact. "I've read your published work on tonal register drift in contact languages. Your analysis of the Sithori-Koran pidgin was interesting." I didn't know what to do with that. Nobody had mentioned my published work since a conference 3 years ago, where 7 people showed up and 2 of them left early. "You study human linguistics?" I asked. "I study failures," she said. "Specifically the kind that happen when 2 civilizations try to speak to each other and discover mid-sentence that they've been using the same words to mean opposite things." She set the instrument aside and stood. She was taller than me by about 4 inches, which is standard for Veilthari women of the court tier, and she moved with the particular unhurried precision of someone who had spent their whole life being watched and had made peace with it long ago. "I'm Princess Alindra," she said, "3rd of the sovereign line." I did the formal Veilthari acknowledgement correctly. Weight shift, lowered gaze, open hands. I'd practiced it enough that it didn't feel rehearsed. She looked at my hands for a moment. "Your form is accurate," she said, "but your left shoulder rises slightly on the gesture. In Veilthari formal reading, that signals either anxiety or social aggression depending on context. Which does it signal right now?" "Anxiety," she said, "which is understandable." A pause. "You should go back before Lord Solith's morning rounds." I went, but at the junction I stopped and turned back, because something in me needed to know. "The music," I said. "What was it?" She considered whether to answer. I could see the consideration, not hesitation, something more deliberate than that. "It's called a passage piece," she said. "Veilthari tradition. You play it on the first morning of a thing that matters, to mark the beginning correctly so the ending has something to return to." I didn't fully understand that. I thought about it all the way back to the East Wing. The formal sessions began that afternoon. The negotiation chamber was a long room with a table grown from a single piece of mineral lattice so old its surface had gone translucent at the edges. I sat at the human end with the 2 junior attachés assigned to support my role. Petra, who handled documentation, and Demi, who handled communications logistics, and had already made it clear she thought this assignment was a career step sideways. The Veilthari delegation was 7 strong, Lord Solith at the center, 4 court officials whose titles I was still memorizing, and 2 advisors I hadn't seen before, positioned slightly behind the main line, the kind of placement that signals either junior status or the kind of seniority that doesn't need to announce itself. The princess was not present. 3rd of the sovereign line didn't sit in first contact trade sessions. That was protocol. Lord Solith opened with a formal territorial acknowledgement that ran 4 minutes and 20 seconds. I translated it in real time, not just the words but the tonal subtext, what the stress placement said about the court's current disposition, which was cautious optimism wrapped in significant skepticism, wrapped in the political necessity of appearing neutral. When I finished, Petra was staring at me. "That was not in the prepared translation," she whispered. "The prepared translation missed about 40% of what he said," I whispered back. Lord Solith was watching me with an expression I couldn't read yet. "You rendered the tonal subtext," he said. "I tried to. The previous 3 human representatives did not." "I know." He studied me for a moment. The tracery along his jaw shifted, blue, deepening, calm, but thoughtful. "Continue," he said. The session ran 3 hours. By the end, my shoulders were in knots and I'd drunk 4 cups of something the Veilthari staff offered that tasted like mineral water with opinions. But something had moved. Not dramatically. There was no breakthrough, no sudden warmth. What shifted was subtler. The Veilthari delegation stopped talking around me and started talking at me. Small difference. Enormous meaning. Demi caught up with me afterward in the corridor. "Lord Solith asked one of the junior officials something after you left," she said. "I caught maybe half of it, but I think he asked whether you'd received private Veilthari instruction." "I haven't." "That's what I figured. What did you do differently in there? I thought about it. I stopped trying to translate what they said. I tried to translate what they meant. She looked at me like I'd said something either obvious or profound, and she hadn't decided which. That evening I received a message through the palace's internal communication system. No sender identification. The text was in Veilthari formal script, high register, which, given what I'd been learning about tonal layers, meant it was from someone significantly above me socially, writing down to me with deliberate care to make sure I understood. It said, "The passage piece has 2 movements. The first marks the beginning. The second is played when the ending arrives, so you know what you've built. I think you understand that already. Most people don't." I read it 3 times. Then I set it down and looked out the window at the mineral tower humming its long note into the evening. And I thought about a princess sitting alone playing music to mark the beginning of something that mattered. And I thought carefully, because hope in strange places can be a dangerous thing, that maybe she hadn't been playing it for herself. Here's the thing about moments like that. The message, the music, the fact that she'd read his work. None of it is an accident. She was watching him before he even knew she existed. But the court? The court still thinks he's a commoner with a broken duffel bag and no title. The word spread through the court the way rumors always do in closed systems. Not loudly, not all at once, but in the particular quiet way that means everyone knows before anyone admits to knowing. The human xenolinguist had been seen coming from the residential corridor. I found out about it the way I found out about most things in that palace, slightly too late, from someone who assumed I already knew. Petra knocked on my door before breakfast with her documentation tablet clutched to her chest, and an expression that told me the morning was about to get complicated. "Lord Solith has requested a preliminary conference," she said. "Before the session, just you." "When?" 20 minutes ago. I went without eating. Solith was in the protocol office, which was a room that managed to feel simultaneously vast and suffocating through the careful use of high ceilings and zero natural light. He was standing when I entered, which I'd learned meant the conversation was not going to be long. "You were seen in the residential approach on your 3rd morning," he said. No preamble, not even a greeting honorific, which in Veilthari formal culture is the equivalent of walking up to someone and skipping the handshake. "I took the wrong corridor," I said. "You spent several minutes in the interior garden." I heard music. He looked at me with the expression of a man doing arithmetic he doesn't like the answer to. "You spoke with Princess Alindra." She informed me I had the wrong corridor. I left. The tracery along his jaw was a color I was starting to learn. Not red, not quite, but something adjacent to it. The kind of color that lives in the space between authority and something more personal. "Commander Voss," he said, and the use of a commander title I didn't hold was deliberate. A warning dressed as courtesy. "The princess is the 3rd of the sovereign line. Whatever impression she may have given you in that setting, her role in these negotiations is ceremonial. She observes. She does not participate. She certainly does not have private conversations with human consultants of undetermined standing." "She was playing music," I said. I apologized for the intrusion and left. That's the whole account. "I'm aware that's your account." The implication sat between us. "Is there a version of this conversation?" I asked, "where you tell me what you're actually concerned about?" Long pause. The tracery shifted. "There have been," he said carefully, 3 previous human negotiators. Each of them, in their own way, attempted to use social access to members of the royal tier as a negotiating shortcut. It does not work. It damages the process, and it insults the court's intelligence. "I'm not doing that." "No," he said, "perhaps not intentionally." He moved to the window. Outside, the morning light was coming in sideways across the mineral spires. "The princess has particular views about these negotiations, views that the sovereign, her father, does not always share. She is passionate, and she is persuasive, and she is occasionally," he paused, "impulsive in her trust of people who have not yet earned it." There was something in the way he said it, not cruelty, something closer to protectiveness wearing the clothes of institutional caution. "I understand," I said. "I wonder if you do." He turned from the window. "You are a commoner, Voss, not an insult, a fact. You have no standing in this court beyond your functional role. The princess has duties, obligations, and a future that has been shaped by considerations far above anything a field consultant from a second-tier colonial division could meaningfully affect. He let that sit. "Stay in your corridor," he said. "Do your work. And if the princess contacts you through any channel, informal or otherwise, you will inform me before responding." He left before I could answer. I stood in the protocol office alone for a moment. Commoner. Second time I'd heard it. Different mouth, same ceiling. The morning session was tense in a way that had nothing to do with the negotiation content. Lord Solith was watching me differently. Not the recalibrating attention of that first day, something more guarded. The junior officials picked up on it, the way subordinates always read their superior's emotional register, faster than the superior realizes. By the midpoint of the session, there was a subtle closing in the Veilthari delegation's body language. Small things. Posture angle. Response latency. The way two of the officials exchanged a glance when I offered a particularly precise tonal translation. Not hostility. Wariness. Which in some ways is harder to work with than hostility, because you can push against hostility. Wariness just waits. I kept doing my job. There wasn't another option. At the end of the third hour, one of the senior Veilthari advisors, a woman named Counselor Veth, who had said almost nothing across 2 days of sessions, addressed me directly for the first time. "Your rendering of the sovereignty clause," she said. "The secondary implication you identified. Where did you study that interpretive framework?" "I didn't," I said. "I worked it out from comparative analysis of the Veilthari formal record you provided in the pre-session materials. In 3 days. I'm a fast reader." She looked at me for a long moment. Her tracery was a color I hadn't cataloged yet. Something pale, almost white. Later I'd learn it meant something close to what humans feel when a thing surprises them in a way they're not sure yet is good or bad. "The sovereignty clause has a third implication," she said. "One that the pre-session materials do not contain. Would you like to attempt it?" Solith made a small sound at the other end of the table. Not quite an objection. A signal. I looked at the clause text on my tablet. Spent about 40 seconds reading it. "The third implication is a rights of refusal protection built into the historical framing," I said. "It's not stated. It's structural. The clause inherits it from the original compact language it was derived from, which means invoking the clause as written technically activates the protection without either party having to name it." The silence in the room was a specific kind. The kind where several people are revising something simultaneously. Counselor Veth leaned back slightly. "You read Old Veilthari," she said. "I recognize root structures. It's not the same as reading." "No," she said. "But it's closer than any human representative has come in 40 years of negotiations with this court." Lord Solith said nothing, but the color of his tracery shifted again, and this time I held it in my memory because I wanted to understand it later. The message that night came through the same channel as before. Same high, formal register. Same lack of sender identification that was, by now, not remotely ambiguous. Counselor Veth spoke to me this evening. She said you found the third implication. I want you to know that I didn't tell you to look for it. I want you to know that because I think it matters to you that it was yours. Lord Solith will be more difficult with you now. I'm sorry for that. I didn't intend for the garden to complicate your position. I wrote back. I probably shouldn't have. Don't apologize for the garden. It was the best 20 minutes I've had since landing. Also, you said the passage piece has 2 movements. What determines when the second one is played? I sent it before I'd thought carefully enough about whether sending it was wise. Her response came back faster than I expected. When the thing that was begun has become something you're no longer willing to lose. I read that 3 times. Same as the first message. Old habit. Outside, something moved in the lower garden. The 6-legged creature again, working through the flowers with the same slow, total concentration. I watched it for a while. There's something steadying about watching something that has no idea it's being observed. The next morning, I came down to the session hall to find a different arrangement. The Veilthari delegation had shifted. Counselor Veth was now at the center position. Lord Solith had moved 1 seat left, which in Veilthari court hierarchy was either a demotion or a deliberate reframing of role. I wasn't sure which yet. And at the far end of the table, in a seat that had not been present the day before, grown directly from the lattice floor overnight in the Veilthari custom of marking new participants, sat Princess Alindra. She was in formal court dress now. The bioluminescent tracery along her collarbone and wrists was visible above the fabric, that steady, deep gold. Her expression was composed and entirely professional, which is a specific kind of face that takes practice to hold. I know because I was holding the same one. Lord Salith looked at me once. His expression communicated several things in a short space of time. The most legible of them was, "This is not what I wanted." The princess did not look at me. She looked at the table, at her materials, at Counselor Veth, at the window, exactly as long at each thing as protocol required. Then the session convened, and for 3 hours we worked through a dispute framework that had been deadlocked for 2 years. And somehow, because of the third implication, because of the trust that Counselor Veth had decided to extend, because of things I couldn't fully account for, it moved. Not resolved, but moved. At the close of the session, the princess gathered her materials and stood with the rest of the Veilthari delegation. As she passed my end of the table, she said, without looking at me, in a register so low that only I was positioned to hear it, "Left shoulder." I'd been holding the tension there since the session opened. I hadn't noticed. I consciously dropped it. She walked out. I stared at the table for a moment. Demi leaned over. "What did she say to you?" "Posture correction," I said. Demi looked at me like she was deciding something. "Caden," she said quietly, "be careful." I knew what she meant. I knew she was right. I knew it the same way you know a lot of things, completely, clearly, and about 4 steps too late. That's the moment. Right there. Not the garden, not the messages, not even the third implication. It's the shoulder. 2 words. She noticed something he didn't say and didn't show, and she named it anyway. That's not protocol. That's not diplomacy. That's someone paying the kind of attention that changes things. The court is watching now. Salith is calculating, and somewhere above all of it, a sovereign father who doesn't yet know his daughter is sitting at a negotiation table for reasons that have started to become personal. The thing about pressure in closed systems is that it doesn't build evenly. It finds the weakest point, and then it finds it again. I woke up on the 9th day to Petra knocking on my door with the same clutched tablet posture as before, which I was beginning to recognize as her version of a distress signal. "Emergency protocol session," she said. "Full delegation, both sides." "What happened?" She turned the tablet so I could see the display. Someone had leaked the negotiation session transcripts. Not summaries, full verbatim records, complete with my tonal subtext translations, the third implication exchange, the sovereignty clause analysis. Everything from 9 days of sessions, transmitted to 3 separate news aggregation networks that operated in the space between human and Veilthari jurisdictions. And someone had framed them. Not falsified, framed. Selected passages pulled from context, arranged to suggest that the human delegation had been deliberately manipulating the tonal subtext translations to engineer concessions the Veilthari court hadn't knowingly agreed to. That the xenolinguists' access to old Veilthari root structures indicated prior coordination with undisclosed Veilthari sources. That the sudden shift in negotiation momentum on day 9 wasn't progress. It was a setup. I read the whole thing standing in my doorway in yesterday's clothes, and I felt something cold settle in the center of my chest. Not panic. Something more focused than panic. Whoever did this knew the sessions in detail, which meant it was someone with direct access. The emergency session convened in a different room. Not the negotiation chamber, a smaller space. No grown furniture. No ceremonial arrangement, portable equipment, temporary seating. The kind of room that gets used when things have moved past formality into something more urgent. I counted 12 people when I walked in. 7 Veilthari, 5 human. Lord Salith at the center of his side, standing. My senior diplomatic attaché, Counselor Brennan, who had arrived from the orbital station that morning, and who I had met exactly once before this assignment, at the center of ours. Princess Alindra was not present. Counselor Veth was, seated and still, with the pale tracery color I'd learned meant unsettled surprise. Lord Salith spoke first, before I'd fully sat down. "The transcripts," he said. contain material that this court considers a significant breach of session confidentiality. Beyond that, he paused, and I could see him choosing the next words with precision. The framing of those materials implies a pattern of deliberate manipulation that, if accurate, would represent a fundamental violation of the trust framework these negotiations depend on. Counselor Brennan looked at me. "Voss," he said, "the translation methodology. Walk us through it." So I did. Every session, every decision, every moment where I'd gone beyond the prepared matrix into live interpretation. I explained the tonal subtext work. I explained how I'd found the third implication. I laid out the full methodology with the particular clarity you get when you have nothing to hide, and have known people wouldn't believe that anyway. When I finished, the room was quiet. "The question," Lord Solith said, "is not whether your methodology was accurate. Based on Counselor Veth's assessment, we accept that it was." A pause. "The question is how the transcripts left this facility, and how the framing was constructed with such specific knowledge of the session dynamics." "Someone in this room," Counselor Brennan said flatly. Nobody objected. The silence that followed had texture to it, the kind of silence where everyone is doing the same calculation, and nobody wants to be the first to show their answer. Lord Solith's tracery shifted. Red, finally. The real thing. "There is an additional concern," he said, and something in his voice had changed. Flattened. The specific flatness of someone managing something painful through professional discipline. The framing of these transcripts includes a particular implication, that the human representative's access to pay, certain informal channels within the palace, represents a coordinated attempt to compromise the integrity of the royal tier. He did not say her name. He did not need to. I kept my face still. Years of fieldwork had given me a decent poker face, but this required more than decent. "That implication is false," I said. "I believe you," Lord Solith said, and it surprised me enough that I almost reacted, which makes the construction of that particular implication more troubling, not less. Someone wanted that inference drawn. Someone constructed these materials specifically to target your presence here, and the princess's participation in the sessions. "Which means," Counselor Veth said quietly, "that someone knew about both, before it was publicly visible." Another silence, longer this time. "The session participant list," I said. "Who had advanced knowledge that Princess Elindra would be joining the table on day 9. Solith looked at me. "That was a sovereign-level decision communicated through standard court channels the evening before," he said carefully. "Standard court channels means internal distribution to how many recipients?" He didn't answer immediately. His jaw tightened. 14, he said. "And how many people on the human side had advance notice?" Counselor Brennan cleared his throat. "The delegation received notification through the diplomatic liaison system. Standard overnight distribution." "Same timing," I said. "Both sides learned simultaneously. Whoever leaked knew both notification streams, which means either they're embedded in both delegations or they have access to communication infrastructure above the individual team level." The room had gotten very still. Counselor Veth leaned forward slightly. "You've been here 9 days. I read fast," I said, "and I've been paying attention to the wrong things for long enough to recognize when someone wants me looking in a specific direction." Lord Solith studied me for a long moment. His tracery was still red, but it had changed quality. Less the Fury variant, more the version I was starting to read as something like concentrated focus. "You have a theory," he said. "I have a question. The 3 previous human negotiators, when they were returned, what was the stated reason each time?" He frowned. "Translation matrix inaccuracies. Cultural protocol violations. In the third case, alleged evidence of undisclosed prior contact with Veilthari commercial interests." "Alleged evidence," I said. "Was it verified?" Long pause. "It was reviewed by the court's protocol assessment body," he said, "which at that time was CLES." He stopped. "Which at that time was staffed by whom?" I asked. He didn't finish the sentence, but something moved behind his eyes. Counselor Brennan pulled me aside after the session broke. We stood in a side corridor, and he spoke quietly in the way of someone who has spent a career having conversations they'd prefer not to have on record. "I'm going to ask you something directly," he said. "All right? The princess. Is there something there that I need to manage?" I looked at him. He was a careful man, I could see that in everything about him. The way he held himself, the way he chose words. Not unkind, calculating in the way that people who operate in political environments learn to be just to survive. There are messages, I said, sent through palace internal channels, about the negotiation process, about linguistic methodology. About the negotiation process, he repeated. Yes, he studied me. Caden. He used my first name for the first time since we'd met. I'm not here to be your adversary, but I need to understand the exposure here. Because if this breaks in the wrong direction, we don't just lose the negotiations. We lose the next 15 years of any possibility of reopening them. I know, I said, and you understand what they'll do with it. The people who constructed those transcripts. If there's any personal dimension to your contact with the princess, they'll use it. They'll make it the story. They'll make everything you've built in 9 days look like it was constructed for the wrong reasons. I know that too. He looked at me for a long moment. Is it worth it? He asked. And here is the honest answer I gave him, which I've thought about many times since. I don't know yet. But I know the negotiations are real. The methodology is real. The third implication is real. And it's the first substantive movement in 2 years of deadlock. Whatever else is complicated, that isn't. He nodded slowly, said nothing else, walked back toward the main corridor. The message that night was different from the others. Same channel, but the register had changed. Not high formal, not the careful, controlled distance of court communication. Something lower, more direct. They questioned my father today, about my participation in the sessions. About our correspondence. He was not angry. He was something worse than angry. He was quiet in the way that means he's already made a decision. I want you to know that I don't regret any of it. The garden, the sessions, the messages. I need you to know that before whatever happens next. I sat with that for a long time. Then I wrote back. What does your father intend to do? Her response took longer this time. Long enough that I'd almost stopped watching the screen. He's convening a formal court assessment tomorrow morning of your standing, your methodology, and the appropriateness of your continued presence in these negotiations. Lord Solith will present the case for your removal. Caden, I have to tell you something. I could stop this. I have standing to address the court in formal session. I could present the full evidence of the negotiation progress, the third implication, everything Counselor Veth has assessed. I could make the case that removing you collapses 2 years of rebuilt momentum in a single morning. But if I do that, they will know why I'm doing it. Not just what I'm saying. Why. And that will become the story instead of the evidence. I read that twice. Then I wrote, let me address the court. Silence. Longer this time. You're a commoner. You have no standing to address the sovereign court directly. I know, I wrote back. Then how? I thought about it. About 9 days of sessions, about tonal subtext and root structures and the third implication, and the way she'd said left shoulder and known without being told. About what it meant to translate not just what people said, but what they meant. Ask your father, I wrote. Not as a princess, not in court. Ask him, personally, before the assessment convenes, to give the human xenolinguist 10 minutes. Why would he agree to that? Because you'll ask him in Old Vale Thari, I said. The root structure form, the one that carries the historical rights of voice protocol for individuals without standing, who have material evidence in sovereign proceedings. The third implication has a precedent. It goes deeper than the clause. Tell him I found it. Another long silence. Then, you found it 2 hours ago, didn't you? You weren't sure until right now. I read fast, I said. A pause. And then something I hadn't seen in any of her previous messages. A single line that carried, even through a formal communication channel, the specific warmth of someone who has just decided to trust a fall. Yes, she wrote. All right, yes. And that's it. That's the pivot. Not a fight. Not a dramatic speech. Not the hero proving himself with fists or firepower. A man with no title, no standing, no court recognition, finding the one door that the law itself left open. And a princess deciding, in the dark, to trust him enough to walk through it first. The assessment convenes tomorrow morning. The sovereign will be there. Lord Solith will be there. The people who built those false transcripts will be watching, certain they've already won. They haven't met the 10th day yet. The sovereign court of Vaelthari Prime convened at first light. Not the negotiation chamber, not the protocol office. The hall of First Compact, the oldest room in the palace, grown from mineral lattice so ancient its surface had gone completely clear, like standing inside frozen light. The ceiling was open to the sky through a lattice filter that softened the morning sun into something diffuse and even, falling across everything without shadows. I had been in the palace 10 days. I had never been inside this room. I stood at the entrance with Counselor Brennan on my left and Petra on my right, and I looked at the assembled court and understood very clearly, in the specific way that cold clarity arrives when the situation has moved past the point of comfortable options, that this room had been chosen deliberately. The Hall of First Compact is where the Vaelthari record decisions that become permanent. Choosing to hold the assessment here was a message about the intended outcome. Lord Solith had been thorough. The sovereign sat at the far end on a seat that wasn't a throne. The Vaelthari don't use thrones the way humans understand them. They use what translates closest to a witness seat, which carries the implication that the person sitting in it is not issuing judgment from above, but receiving truth at center. Sovereign Aldrich was older than his formal portrait suggested, with tracery that had deepened over decades into something almost architectural along his jaw and temples. His expression was unreadable in the way of someone who has spent 50 years making decisions and has learned to let nothing show until he's ready. Princess Elindra sat 3 seats to his left, formal court position for the third of the sovereign line during an assessment session, present, but without speaking rights unless directly addressed. She did not look at me when I entered. Protocol. I did not look at her. Also protocol. Counselor Veth was present. 12 court officials I recognized from the sessions, 4 I didn't. And in the far left corner, so positioned that they were visible without being central, 2 figures whose tracery patterns I'd spent the last 2 hours memorizing from the palace staff registry. I'd found them at midnight. Petra had helped, which surprised me, and then didn't. Lord Solith opened the assessment with a formal address that ran 7 minutes. I translated it in my head as he spoke, not because I needed to, but because it kept me calm and present in the specific way that work does when everything else is loud. His case was precise, well constructed. He presented the leaked transcripts, the framing implications, the inappropriate corridor access, the informal communication channel usage. He presented them factually, without embellishment, which made them more effective than if he'd argued emotionally. He was good at this. I want to be fair about that. He was genuinely good at it. He presented the communication records between myself and an unnamed member of the royal tier. Didn't identify her. Protocol protected that. But everyone in the room knew, and the deliberate anonymizing of it made it worse somehow, not better. The way not naming a thing can make it heavier than naming it outright. He concluded by recommending my immediate removal from the negotiations and a formal review of all session materials for evidence of manipulated consent. Counselor Brennan began the human delegation's response. I put my hand briefly on his arm. He stopped, looked at me. 10 minutes, I said quietly. He held my gaze for a moment. Then he stepped back. I addressed the sovereign directly. In Vaelthari, not modern formal register, the root structure form, the one that carries the historical rights of voice protocol, the one I'd found at midnight and spent 4 hours getting right, rehearsing the tonal placement until the stress patterns felt less like performance and more like the thing itself. The room went very still. I said, Sovereign Aldrich, witness seat holder, I invoke the rights of voice precedent established in the Third Compact Year, under the provision that allows an individual without standing to present material evidence when that evidence bears directly on the integrity of the proceedings under review. The silence that followed was the particular kind that happens when a room full of people revises their understanding of a situation simultaneously. Lord Solith said, in human standard, very quietly, You read old Vaelthari. I recognize root structures, I said. It's not the same thing. But it was enough. The sovereign looked at me for the first time since I'd entered the room. His tracery was that deep, unreadable color of long-practiced composure. Then he said, in perfect human standard that carried no accent at all, which I hadn't expected, Speak. I didn't argue my own case. That's the thing people misunderstand about moments like this. They think the move is to defend yourself, to make the strongest version of your own argument, to out-logic the opposition. That's not the move. The move is to give the room something true that it can't walk back from. I presented the transcript analysis. Not mine. The methodology I'd applied to the leaked documents themselves. The same tonal subtext work I'd been doing in the sessions. Because whoever had constructed the framing had made an error. Small, but structural. The selected passages had been arranged to suggest manipulated consent. But the tonal subtext of those same passages, read correctly, showed the opposite. The Vailthari delegation's responses across 9 sessions showed a consistent pattern of voluntary engagement, genuine recalibration, and what the formal linguistic record categorizes as uncoerced forward movement. You cannot fake that pattern in transcripts. It's too distributed, too embedded in small moments across too many sessions to construct retroactively. Someone had pulled the words. They hadn't understood what the words were doing beneath the surface. I laid it out passage by passage. 20 minutes, not 10. Nobody stopped me. Then I presented the communication records that Petra had pulled at midnight. Not the messages between myself and the princess, but the outgoing traffic from 2 palace communication nodes that had been used to transmit the leaked transcripts. Traffic that, when mapped against the session notification distribution list, narrowed the origin point to 2 possible sources. The 2 figures in the far left corner. I didn't accuse them. I presented the technical evidence and let the room draw the conclusion. Because an accusation from someone with no standing is a provocation, but evidence laid before a witness seat is a different thing entirely. The sovereign looked at the 2 figures. They didn't run. People in court positions rarely do. They're too trained for visible composure. But the tracery on both of them shifted in a color I'd never seen before, and hope I don't see again. Lord Solith was looking at them too. His expression told me that he hadn't known, and that not knowing made him furious in a way that had nothing to do with me anymore. The assessment recess lasted 40 minutes. I stood in an anteroom with Counselor Brennan and Petra, and nobody said very much. Brennan paced. Petra reorganized her tablet files 3 times. I looked at the wall and thought about a passage piece with 2 movements, and what it meant for the ending to have something to return to. When we were recalled to the hall, the sovereign was still in the witness seat. The 2 figures from the corner were not. Lord Solith stood at his original position, and something in his posture had changed in the particular way that happens when a person has had 40 minutes to revise a significant assumption and is still in the process of recalibrating around the gap it left. The sovereign spoke. His human standard was careful and precise. He said the assessment findings did not support the removal of the human xenolinguistic consultant. He said the court recognized the rights of voice invocation as valid and correctly applied. He said the evidence presented regarding the transcript leak would be referred to the court's investigative body for formal review. He paused. Then he said, "The negotiations will resume tomorrow, with the full participation of all previously seated delegates." He did not look at his daughter when he said it, but she was 3 seats to his left and I wasn't looking at her either. And in the hall of First Compact, where decisions become permanent, the room held all of it anyway, documented in the acoustics of mineral lattice that has been recording truth for 6,000 years. Lord Solith found me in the corridor after. I expected another warning, another calibrated statement about standing and ceilings and the appropriate limits of a commoner in a sovereign court. What he said was, the 3rd implication. I reviewed it last night. "All right," I said. "I've been the protocol director of this court for 19 years, he said. I was present for every session of the previous 3 failed negotiations. I did not see the 3rd implication. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has the integrity to acknowledge a thing he'd prefer not to. "You're not what I assumed you were," he said. "No," I said. "I know." A pause. His tracery was the pale, uncertain color, Counselor Veth's color, the one that means something has surprised you in a way you haven't finished processing. "The princess has her mother's instincts," he said quietly. "Not to me, really. More like something escaping. Her mother could read people in 30 seconds, walk into a room full of political calculation, and immediately find the one person who wasn't calculating." He didn't say anything else. He walked back toward the protocol wing. I stood in the corridor for a moment. Then I went back to the east wing, sat on the edge of my bed, and wrote nothing for a long time. The message came late. He spoke to me tonight. My father. Not in court. Not formally. He came to the residential garden and sat down and asked me to tell him, in my own words, not court language, what I thought was actually happening in these negotiations. I told him everything: the garden, the messages, the third implication, the passage piece. He listened. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said something I want to tell you. He said, "Your mother used to say that the most dangerous thing in any negotiation was a person who wasn't trying to win, because they were the only ones who could actually change something." He asked me if I thought you were trying to win. I told him no. I told him I thought you were trying to get it right. Another long pause. Then he said, "Those are usually the same person. Caden. He wants to meet you. Not in formal session, not through protocol channels. In the garden, tomorrow morning, first light." I read that slowly, all the way through, then again. Then I wrote back, "I'll be there." A pause. Then her response, "Bring your notes. He'll want to talk about the sovereignty clause. But Caden, after that, after the formal part, I want to show you the second movement." The treaty framework was completed 6 weeks later, not by diplomats alone, by a working group that included Councillor Veth, 2 of the Vailthari Court's senior legal architects, Councillor Brennan, Petra, and a xenolinguist who had arrived with a broken duffel bag and no title, and spent 6 weeks translating not just what people said, but what they were trying to build. The formal signing was public, broadcast to both human and Vailthari networks. Sovereign Aldreth signed first. Councillor Brennan signed for the Colonial Alliance. There were speeches, long ones, the kind that need to exist for a moment to be real to the people who weren't in the room. I stood at the back of the hall and watched. Princess Elindra stood at her father's side in full ceremonial court dress. Her tracery, a color I'd never seen before. Not gold, not the pale, uncertain white, not the deep, measured calm of formal sessions. Something new, warm and certain in equal measure. She was looking at the signing, not at me. Protocol. But her left shoulder was dropped and level, easy and unheld, the way it looks on someone who is not carrying anything they're afraid of anymore. That was enough. You know what gets me about this story? It's not the treaty. It's not the court session or the third implication or even the moment in the hall of first compact. It's that garden at first light. A man who got called a commoner twice in 9 days showing up anyway, doing the work, translating not just the language but the people underneath it. Cerelia's father had it right. The ones who aren't trying to win are the only ones who can actually change something. And somewhere, in a palace of grown mineral and living light, a princess played the second movement for the ending, so it had something to return to. If this story stayed with you the way it stayed with me, tell someone about it. Leave a comment with which moment hit you hardest, because I genuinely want to know. And if you want more stories where humans show up, do the quiet, impossible thing and change everything without throwing a single punch. You already know where to find them. HFY Soundscape. We'll be here.